Guys, I don't know what kind of negligence I've been dealing with over the last 2+ years of doing this podcast, but somehow I have managed to never sit down with one of my all-time favorite podcasters, Rania Khalek. Welcome to Bad Faith Podcast, Rania.
Well, Briahna, thank you for having me. And the feeling is mutual. I'm so excited to have a chat with you.
People might not know this. I've talked a lot on this show because obviously Katie Halper is a frequent guest about how she's one of my first friends in the podcasting world, one of the first people I've ever met in real life, one of my fastest friends in the podcasting world. But what people don't know is that I was introduced to Katie Halper because I was listening to you in Unauthorized Disclosure.
Oh my God, no way. I did not know this.
Yeah,
breaking news.
Way back in the before times. At like
pre-Birdie.
2015. I don't even know how I found your podcast, but it was on Unauthorized Disclosure that I first was introduced to Katie Halper, and then I hopped over to the Katie Halper show and was listening to both, and that's how my universe grew. So when I say this is an incredible oversight and that us chatting here is years coming, like that's what I mean.
That's so cool. No, that actually like makes me really happy that like anything I was involved with could be a gateway for someone going down the rabbit hole of for me. So for me, it was Democracy Now! Was like one of my biggest, that and others was like a big gateway drug for me where I was like, oh, this is who Noam Chomsky is. This is who, like, and all these other people on and on and on. But yeah, anyways, it's very good. It's very cool to hear. That really makes me happy.
I mean, it was so long ago, Rania, that I have some clips coming up. Everybody gird your loins, like prepare yourselves. I have some clips coming up from the most recent episode of Pod Save America. I thought we could react to a little bit. But back then it wasn't even Pod Save America. It was Keeping It 1600. That's how long ago it was that I was in this podcast rotation of, I was listening back in the day. They part of the rebrand of Keeping It 1600 to Pod Save was that, I'm sure you remember this, they really, I think, oversold how confident they were about Hillary Clinton winning the election in 2016.
Well, okay, so I have
a lot of crow.
Well, I have a confession. I don't, the one you just named, the one before Pod Save, I don't know what that is.
So that was the Jon Favreau podcast vehicle in the before times, in the pre-Trump era. It was basically the same show with the same people on it, but it had a different logo. It was like green with like the White House. And it was more, I think, explicitly branded as former Obama speechwriters do a political podcast. But if you go back, I wonder if you can still find it on the internet. If you go back to the episode prior to the election, they were fully, they were almost saying, don't even bother to vote. Hillary's got this so in the bag.
And that's how she lost.
Exactly. So they ate a lot of crow. In their defense, they were very humbled by that and were very they ate a lot of crow in the next episode, and they were very cautious going forward. And even today, you can hear them say on the podcast things like, well, I never want to make a prediction because they're still so burned by what happened back then. But yeah, we've a lot has changed. The left is in a whole different place than it was back then. And that's part of what I wanted to bring you on to talk about. It's been a big few weeks in left politics.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of things that have been going on. Let's start with this. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who some in left media have expressed frustration about because she rarely does sit downs with the left media figures that first sort of put her on the map. Glenn Greenwald did an early interview with her at The Intercept. Jamie Dore did an early interview with her on his show. She has done 2 interviews recently, one with Jacobin Magazine that was just, I think, about a week ago, and one at the end of August with the New York Times. Obviously not a lefty mag, but some insight into where she is, generally speaking. So maybe we should start there. Just right off the bat, did anything strike you as unusual, telling, revealing, clarifying, helpful at all about either of these sit-downs?
I mean, okay, not really from what she said. It was more about the way she was treated. And I thought it was quite interesting that she received what I thought looked like a very kid gloves approach from both a very mainstream outlet, the paper of record that sets the agenda, that's like obviously very pro-centrist, and initially was skeptical of her, that she has managed to like not hypnotize isn't the right word, but they're sort of like infatuated with her. Like the mainstream has become infatuated with her in a way they were not in the beginning. So that to me suggests she doesn't pose as much as a threat in their eyes as maybe she did at first when they viewed her as this maybe scary potential socialist. And then on the flip side, I thought Jacobin, and it wasn't just this interview they did with her, by the way, though I thought it was interesting they got that interview. It was a very kid gloves approach, very like infatuated, but then also a couple other pieces they've had recently about her and how amazing she is, which I've been kind of surprised to see. So I guess that's what struck me is that, you know, she just has become like somehow managed to get both the at least ostensibly online paper of the left or magazine of the left to love her, as well as the mainstream. But then I don't know, like Briahna, when it comes to the conversation around AOC, like I also feel like on the left, we do have to be real about who she was from the beginning, right? Like in the beginning, she was very exciting because she did give off this like very obvious sort of DSA insurgency vibe. But it's not like she was like some Bolshevik like coming in to like, you know, storm DC and like, you know, like, I don't know, force billionaires to give up their money and like confiscate wealth. You know, she wasn't like saying that at the beginning. And it's also not like she really came in from like the organized left either, right? Like, I don't really remember hearing of her or seeing of her, you know, the before times, as you call them, which I love, by the way, right? It's like before Christ and after. Here we're talking before Trump. Oh God, that was a terrible comparison.
Not BC, BAOC.
BAOC, there we go. I love that. So BAOC, right? Like, it's like no one had ever really heard of her. Not that I, you know, say that makes her bad. It's just, it's not like she was showing up to like anti-war protests as far as I remember. Or it's not like anybody in like actual grassroots leftist organizations really knew who she was. So, you know, she hasn't been the most like solid ideologically like left correct person, I guess, throughout her career. So I think when it comes to AOC, we do need to take a step back and like remember that at this, like, I don't know, did we expect too much of her? I don't know. I think she also sort of rode the coattails of like the upsurge of excitement for socialism as Bernie Sanders was kicking off between 2016 2020. So I don't know. That's what came off to me. Like, I didn't really see anything that surprised me too much, except I thought Jacobin was way too nice to her.
So let's get into this a little bit, because I agree largely with the characterization of the Jacobin interview with Dan Denver, but I was actually surprised by how adversarial the New York Times piece ended up being. So it was framed as, the title of the piece was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on how she's changed. Subhead, the congresswoman from New York says she's different from when she took office, but she's not ready to call herself an insider. So right off the bat, the framing is that AOC even is acknowledging some shift from who she presented herself as being initially. So even if, I think that the question that you're raising about whether or not the left was too credulous of her or had too high expectations is a reasonable question. But even in the context of the framing of this article, is AOC holding herself to a different standard? Does AOC see herself as having shifted? One of the first questions is exactly that. You use these words, evolving but rooted. It kind of captures that tension. So I want to explore with you. You're in your third term now. Your job is not new. A lot has changed since you were first elected in 2018. What is the thing that has changed most about you since she first took office? And she talks about growing confidence and feeling the need to prove herself before, and now she's been there for a while. But there's a follow-up question. When you say things have changed for you personally, she says, when I first came into office, I was unproven in a way that I think many other people may not be, right? There are a lot of people that are elected with a history of legislating. And I very much felt that I had to prove two things at the same time that were often at odds with each other. I had to prove to the people that elected me that I am committed and very well grounded in all of the values and issues and fights, from taking on a party establishment that can be very calcified to continuing to fight for landmark progressive issues like Medicare for all and comprehensive changes to our immigration system or criminal justice reform. And the second was that I had to prove to this world of Washington that I was serious and skilled, and that I wasn't just here to make a headline, but that I was here to engage in this process in a skilled and sophisticated way, that I did my homework, so to speak. I'm going to say, for the sake of our conversation, that we care less about her proving herself to Washington. But to that first question, did she in fact prove to the left that elected her that she was grounded in all the values and the issues and the fights, taking on the party establishment, et cetera?
Yeah, no, I don't know that that's necessarily her fault. I don't think she did. Look, when it comes to AOC, I don't think it has to be she's either horrible and we hate her, right? Not that I'm saying you're saying that at all, but I think there's like kind of two tendencies in the left online world, right? The one is AOC is fantastic and perfect. We love her. Don't criticize her. It's not fair. And the other is I hate her. I hate everything she does. She sucks. She's a liar. She's a fraud. And maybe there's like a few truths to both of those things. But I do think when it comes to her, we can take a bit of a step back, right? Like when she does something good, I think we can credit her for that. Sometimes she does do good things. And then when she does something that we would think on the left is bad, I think we can also openly say that. What's actually, I think, relevant about AOC from the point of view of people who like really want to make change, though, is that right now there's all of this like struggle around the issue of socialism and giving it meaning and giving it substance and to give it a definition. And AOC did help make that word relevant. So I'll give her credit for that. I mean, she did after Bernie Sanders. She helped maybe keep it a little relevant after Bernie Sanders. Whether she's actually a socialist or not is a different discussion. But I mean, that's a role she did play. And she's part of like that broader wave, like I mentioned, of that Bernie kicked off after 2016, after the, what is the after times, if it's not the before times, that's given socialism this whole new relevance. And people who were organizing for radical change can then use it and take advantage of that sort of like echo chamber to try to give it the substance that maybe AOC doesn't. But then sometimes, of course, that means struggling against AOC, which perhaps some of the more visible people on the left don't do enough of, right? Like she is a member. So is she still a member of the DSA? I think she is.
I believe so. But I think, Rania, you're touching on this crucial question, which is there a risk that she is neutering the brand, as it were, if she is both popularizing or riding on the coattails of the Bernie movement and popularizing terms like socialism or democratic socialism, and then on the other hand, not taking an approach that is especially adversarial to the democratic establishment. If you have someone who is in fact an insider, which is something that they end up debating in this article, who is adopting the mantle of an outsider, does that make people less trusting in authentically outsider campaigns? Does that make people think that, well, the outsider approach doesn't work at all when it might with a candidate that is more genuinely rooted in an independent org or a movement, as opposed to seemingly being more of a totem, like a spokesperson that wags the tail of the dog? And is that something that people on the left should be critiquing, precisely because there is this way that she can serve to validate inappropriately establishment actors like the Democratic Party or Joe Biden specifically?
I think absolutely. Like she has to be critiqued. And I think one of the mistakes on the left was being too scared to critique her for a while. It's kind of that like Obama effect, right? Her and Obama, I think, do have different politics. Like I wouldn't put her necessarily in that sort of insider category because Obama was an outsider, like an outsider because of who he was, like as a personality, but definitely an insider as far as his politics were concerned. He was like a complete centrist. Whereas I think AOC is much more progressive than him, at least so far, for now. And she does there are some things she has done, right? Like she's one of 20 people who signed onto this letter not too long ago about lifting sanctions on Venezuela and Cuba. Mm-hmm. That's something on the left that we should support. And we should use that sort of momentum as a way to address the issue of these blockades. She's also been horrendous on other issues. And on those issues, we should call her out. And I think that's where the left should be positioning itself. But I think you're absolutely right. We do need to be very cognizant of the fact that someone like AOC, who's very likable, who's using the word socialism, but also doesn't really have a background in it, and has demonstrated repeatedly that she isn't really answering to the supposed left base that got her into office, or that at least, the DSA base that she's supposedly a part of, doesn't really hold her accountable, I think, for a lot of the issues that she doesn't really agree with them on, which I think is quite problematic. Yeah, I do think there's a huge risk there. However, I also think, Briahna, as important as AOC as a figure is to discuss and to critique and to have this debate or not debate, I think we pretty much agree mostly on this. I think also one of the biggest problems that we have is this obsession with the celebrity politics, right? Yes, these kind of celebrity politicians, while they are quite important because they can reach so many people and help make certain issues or ideas or words like socialism seem relevant. At the same time, we can't just lean on them for it. And that's where like the organizing spaces and actual institutions that we need to be like grounded in there all the time, pushing these people and doing other work besides just engaging with, you know, like political celebrities. That's so important. I think that also speaks to some of the things we might talk about if we're going to talk about third party stuff. I think that also speaks to that too, is like, I think that's what we're lacking here when a lot of our conversations end up being about these celebrity politicians or sort of like these like seemingly celebrity people having these discussions, is what about what's actually happening on the ground? And that is like where a lot of our attention, at least on the online left, doesn't go. But the sort of like grassroots organizing and ground stuff.
The third party conversation, I think, is relevant here because I do think that part of what we all recognized was the limited scope of a celebrity politician, if you will, even a celebrity politician like Bernie Sanders, was their ability to shift the Overton window. And one of the things that is said most about Bernie Sanders is that his 2016 run made it possible for folks to feel like they could even articulate a desire for something like a universal healthcare system. And was something that forced all of the other candidates in the debate stage in 2020, in good faith or not, to at least pretend like they supported some version of a single payer healthcare system. And so that being said, Bernie Sanders and AOC both coming out so quickly and endorsing Joe Biden before, it's hard for me to even say before the Democratic primary started, because the Democratic Party has made it clear that there will be no Democratic primary, has said so explicitly through any number of spokespeople. There will be no primary. But does that serve the role then? If we've put these people on a pedestal, I think it is worth looking at their statements, because I think as much as they had the potential to expand the Overton window, they also have the ability to shut it.
Yes. And on the
really
third party
destructive
issue.
ways. Yeah.
Yeah, no. And on the 30-party issue, I mean, I don't know how much, I mean, AOC, has she bashed third parties? I'm not sure. You would know this better than me. I think you follow.
I don't think she's mentioned them. I think that she, in that Pod Save America interview from, let's say, I don't know, a month or so now, she was asked about whether or not she endorsed Joe Biden. And she said yes. And of course, the controversy is that it seems in contrast with a version of her that during the 2020 campaign said that any civilized country, any normal country with a normal political system, that she and Joe Biden would not even be in the same party.
Yeah, and she's not wrong about that, sadly, because the U.S. is like, and I do want to get to that, by the way, since I am talking to you from Lebanon, I do want to mention, like, after we discuss this, just about the way that other people abroad view this kind of stuff, because I think it's an important perspective that doesn't ever really get understood or talked about or given any airtime in the US. However, when it comes to the issue of the third party, I mean, I do think that obviously Bernie Sanders is a huge disappointment on this. I wish Bernie Sanders could debate Bernie Sanders from like 30 or 40 years ago when he had a very different, as I'm sure you know, perspective on third parties. And I also think, though, like when I mentioned before with AOC and like the need to be focusing more on institutions, like I think part of making the left stronger is also about building, like I mentioned, institutions and grassroots organizing. And that's one of the things that third parties can also be useful for if they're coming out of some of those grassroots organizing and institutions. For example, like, you know, you have Cornel West is a hugely important figure, and now he's running, I believe, in the Green Party, right? Mm-hmm. You also have a few other people, like you have Claudia de la Cruz and Karina Garcia, who are running for president and vice president on the PSL ticket, on the Party for Socialism and Liberation. They just announced that last week. And these are people who I personally know and I really like, but I also love their politics. They've been doing this sort of grassroots organizing for a long time with PSL, right? So like when things like Ukraine happen or Syria or Libya, these are the kinds of people, this was the type of group that was always loud about that, always in front, always getting people to care about it and come out and protest. Also on domestic issues like police brutality. And so that's like one of the things that I think is important to use third parties to discuss as well, is like we need to be building institutions that push back not just during elections, but after and between them. And there's this like focus on the third party spoilers, right? That's the only time you hear a lot of the people that are critiquing you, Briahna, are critiquing you only when there's an election. When there's an election, it's like Briahna and Susan Sarandon and like all these people are ruining things for Democrats. But like, where are these people in between elections holding the people that they're demanding we vote for accountable? I don't see them doing that. And that's what's really, really frustrating. And I mean, this is one of the reasons someone like even AOC, who's not even a third party person, she's just slightly more progressive than a regular Democrat. And even she doesn't really work because there's no institution behind her. And I mean, even the Green Party, like they've had Ralph Nader, they've had other really great people like Jill Stein and now Cornel West, and all of whom are fantastic people. But even with them, like what happens between elections or when the election is over, right? It's like as an entity, what's really been done. And this is not to critique them. It's really, again, they're great people, but we have to think of more like the permanence of our political strategies that can like further ground left politics, not just during election season. It's very sad that the only times we get to have this conversation is when people are dunking on you over third parties because, even before there's ever been a primary that's never going to happen, you're already the bad guy, or anybody having your opinion is the bad guy.
So for one, I will say, I do sometimes think that there is a ease with which people overstate how the Green Party is somehow uniquely uninvolved in local elections or something like that. I mean, as someone who comes from New York, I have seen plenty, frankly, a heartening amount of Green Party activity and successes. I think Jabari Brisport was on the very first episode of this podcast, right? And it frustrates me sometimes that I know that you're not doing this, but some people who are, I think, underwhelmed by the possibility of Green Party politics as an avenue of change will say things like, well, why should I support the Green Party when they haven't been doing X, Y, and Z on the ground? And to that, I would say that's an institutional problem across a lot of burgeoning parties who have very little money and support. And that's an argument for the person who's naysaying to like join the Green Party and help, not to then go vote for the Democratic Party whose goals and interests are antithetical to my own, right? So I'm not going to cast my lot with people who are actively trying to hurt me just because the group that is actually trying to help me is poorly funded and poorly staffed and struggling to get off of the ground. I will say that I'm in talks right now to bring the PSL candidates on. I look forward to talking to them as well, because my philosophy is yes, and I'm never going to poo-poo a political effort by anyone who shares my values. And I say that as someone who, I just invited Mehdi Hassan on the show. I've done so before, and I suspect he won't take me up on the offer. But, even though he's been very critical of my stance in the Krystal Kyle interview that we've both been alluding to, I appreciate him as one of the few people on mainstream news that at least on a basic level, like supports Medicare for all. And I would much rather a world where instead of trying to drag each other or dunk, as you say, each other on the internet, we were trying to work through why it is we felt differently about certain issues or certain paths of approach from a good faith perspective. But we obviously don't live in that world, but that doesn't mean I'm going to stop trying for us to get to that world.
No, and I would love to see that conversation. I really encourage Mehdi to come on. I would really love to see that conversation because, and I don't disagree with what you said about the Green Party. I really think it's like specific to local areas. I've heard some really good things about some things that running on local tickets in certain areas and it really working out. And then maybe like in a different state or in a different locale not working out. So like that's like you said, institution, not a lot of money. And they have done a lot. It's just a matter of like, I think this speaks to the fact that sadly, we only get to talk about these things and focus on them when there's an upcoming election. And that is sort of the, I guess, like one of the downfalls of the focus on electoral politics in the US as the only avenue of change. And I'm not saying that you're saying that or that the Green Party is saying that. It's just that's how the system kind of is, because there is so much focus nationally in the US on the only way you engage civically is through voting. And that's where it ends. So it's just like a natural, I think, inclination. And that's also the way the media covers things too. And that's how they want to cover things. But real quick, just to like the people who are critiquing you, one thing that I think is really interesting about a lot of them, and this is not to personalize anything, it's just a lot of them do happen to live in places where these elections like aren't even contested, right? Mm. So to those people, I do wonder what their excuse is. Like if you live in a swing state, fine, you feel uncomfortable, you're scared to throw it to Trump, you want to throw it to Biden, okay, like let's put aside the swing state argument. I mean, I'm someone who grew up in a swing state, or what's become a swing state, which is Virginia. So I get it. And I get like also locally in the governorship, and there's things you don't want to hand over to Republicans. Fine. I'll be generous and let that go. But for a lot of these people, Briahna, like living in California or New Jersey or Louisiana, or I think Minnesota. I mean, I don't know if any of your critics live in Minnesota, but they might. But these are places where third parties are actually guaranteed to be on the ballot a lot of times. So like, what's their excuse? Because, you know, if 1 million people voted for, let's say, PSL or Cornell West in California, it literally wouldn't make a difference whatsoever in that Trump-Biden calculus. But it would obviously make a very big difference in the body politic if socialists were like breaking 1 million votes in the most populous state. So why are people who live in these places ragging on you for the Biden thing? Like, why aren't they talking up that, yes, Biden is terrible on this, that, and the other? So if you live in one of these places where Trump isn't even in play, why not vote for the actual left candidates, right? So fine, I don't agree with Briahna, let's say on Florida or Virginia. We don't agree with you there. But in Texas or Louisiana or California, we do like agree in all these places that are uncontested that you should be voting for people who are actual left candidates. Like, why can't that be the conversation? And if you have Mehdi on, I'd love for you to ask him that.
Well, so for one, as I said in the chat with Krystal and Kyle, I'm not only not in the business of like trying to persuade people. Ironically, I feel like I've come to my position from talking to a lot of people one-on-one, largely in like the call-in context, a call-in show that I have. And not because I'm trying to evangelize. I'm just trying to give voice to what exists, like the sentiments that exist. And I do feel that part of why I think the conversation with Krystal and Kyle could have been perhaps a little bit more productive is if we just acknowledge that we disagree about approach and started talking about why we feel the way that we feel. Because I feel like I really do understand Krystal's argument. I understand having the feeling that the union gains through the NLRB are enough to validate voting for Joe Biden again, and to want something that you want to preserve because you believe that bigger revolutionary change is going to happen with the workforce. I think that's a perfectly reasonable argument, but I disagree with it, and I don't think there was a lot of interest publicly outside of the context of that debate too in understanding why. And part of that is that the part that didn't get unpacked very much was that I said this to Chomsky. I feel this as a Black American. I know that a lot of poor and working class people feel this way, which is that there is not, in fact, on the issues that matter most to a lot of people. And this is controversial, but there is not, in fact, a significant difference between their lives under Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And that is not to minimize the things that that Donald Trump did to hurt new people, but it is to honor the excessive harms of the status quo that get conveniently papered over in every election season because someone comes up with some new way to be a bad guy. And the question is, how do you prevent new ways that the Republicans figure out to be a bad guy? Why do we keep having worse and worse candidates every year? It's because there's literally no backstop against it. So there's this really perverse thing that happens where, say you're some historically marginalized group sitting around in 1980, you're 15 years out of the civil rights movement. You were the first person to even be in your integrated class. And here comes somebody telling you that you have to vote for, coming out of the 80s, Bill Clinton, because he's better than the alternative. Okay, fine, I did that. And now Bill Clinton does the crime bill. He cuts the social welfare state in a way the Republican only dream of. And we've been stuck in that cycle for all of these years. So my simple question, which no one has been able to answer, is what ends that process? And how do you tell people who are already suffering under the status quo why they should continue to shackle themselves to a party that's shown no interest in absolving that, only in addressing the newest of problems while all the old problems get grandfathered in? And instead of a solidarity movement that says, I hate that Donald Trump is attacking trans people. I hate that he's doing a Muslim ban. And I also hate that there has been a racialized tier of poor people in the United States of America since time immemorial. And all those groups should join together and make demands that the Democratic Party put forward candidates that are going to address all of our needs. There is this fracturing where we're told, well, if you really cared about trans people, then you'd basically abandon the interests of the poor people, the working poor and poor in America. If you really cared about the Muslim ban, then you would abandon all these other people's interests. And in this context, if you really care about, I saw some people say, if you really care about the environment, I guess you'll abandon all these people's interests. Also, so those things aren't intersectionally connected. And as though Joe Biden is going to do anything to keep us from hitting the climate cliff. And with the union stuff specifically that Krystal was bringing up, I have no interest in minimizing that. I think it's significant. I think it's important. I think, I'll admit to it being as however important as you want it to be.
Yeah.
But do we believe, given the systems of power that we understand exist in this country, that Joe Biden, who took more corporate money than anybody else in the Democratic primary, is going to allow there to be any real revolutionary change through labor?
No.
Or is this a carrot that he threw literally months after he crushed a rail strike that many people saw as a genuine opportunity to widespread revolutionary labor action?
No, I think you're absolutely right. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry. I've been filibustering.
Well, no. I think you're absolutely right. And I think you're getting at something really important because you mentioned 1980. Now, I think since 1980, there has been this big focus on the lesser of two evil voting.
Yeah.
And since the 1980s, politics has moved where? It's moved further to the right? So that tells us something, right? That tells us that if you want to move politics to the left, you have to have bigger, stronger, more radical movements and political interventions to affect the broader political scene. I mean, even just all you have to do is look at history, look back at the 1930s, the 1960s, even you go back even further, the Reconstruction period, right?
Yeah.
Any period in the US of progressive change has been a period, like whether also you can mention the period leading up to the Civil War, by the way. What moved the political center the most was the growth of explicit radical movements with a very clear ideology that spoke to the problems that people had at the scale to which the problem existed at that time, right? And then made people want to rally around that and ultimately force the establishment to respond to that progressive radical insurgency in whatever era the context was. That's how things changed. It wasn't, if you go back and look historically, I'm not some academic, but the lesser of two evil thing, it really is a more modern phenomenon. And every 4 years or every 2 years sometimes, it's used once again to basically try and suppress revolutionary ideas, potential, desire for change, and to just keep everyone sort of managed. And that goes back to the issue of who's actually controlling all of this, right?
Yeah.
This whole political system is controlled by billionaires. It's controlled by big business. So politics is essentially how these people, how billionaires and big business are reacting to us, to normal people, reacting to their policies and really just trying to control it and keep the status quo on some level. They're managing a system. And that's why we have these two parties that are so similar, but have, obviously some very important differences, but a great deal of crossover because they're literally managed by the same kinds of people. One of them happens, one side of this happens to organize a lot of people around conservative politics. And then the other one tries to organize people around this kind of more progressive sounding politics. That gives us this really dictatorial two-party landscape where we have Democrats and Republicans. At the end of the day, though, it's just look at the last 40 years. It's literally moved further and further to the right. So we have to do something different. And for anybody who's suggesting we do the same thing by invoking the idea of fascism, which honestly, I think is really lazy at this point. And we don't have to get into what fascism is or isn't. But it's either you choose between a fascist or between Biden, by the fascist or this Democrat. It's again, we've had this conversation every 4 years and nothing changes. It just becomes more right wing. And one thing I'll add to that is I understand everything you were saying, but the fact that average people, their lives don't really change no matter who's in charge. And I mentioned to you, I'm talking to you from the Middle East right now. And nobody where I live or in other parts of the world, they all watch these elections just as much as we do. but they have no say. Why does the whole world watch? They don't watch any other country pick a president the way they watch America pick a president. And that's because the US is like a dictator. It runs the world. And everybody in the third world especially knows that who gets elected kind of matters, but also kinds of doesn't. Because I hear from a lot of people who will just literally say, like, it doesn't matter if it's Biden or Trump. It didn't matter if it was Hillary or Trump. We're still going to get bombed. We're still going to get sanctioned. And the US is still going to do whatever it wants to do. That's how a lot of the world sees it. I mean, that obviously is like a very, like, it's lacking a lot of nuance.
Let's drill down on that a little bit, because this was a point of contention. By the way, I had a lot of other things to say about the AOC stuff, and maybe we'll come back to that toward the end. But a lot of the reaction that people had was to this idea that, like, it is like meaningful. You know, you have to acknowledge that Biden is better than Trump. And I feel two ways about that. One, it's very easy to say, yeah, sure, obviously. Like, Biden doesn't say openly racist things most of the time. He didn't do a Muslim ban. He believes in a woman's right to choose, not personally, but for the rest of the country. As a Catholic.
You're asking for a lot. You're asking for a lot.
So I can name those things that are obviously better from Biden than Trump. But, like, there's a part of me that feels like that's very dishonest, because depending on what your priority is, people talk about politics as though there's two things. There are issues, and whether you feel one way or another about the issue, and then there's how you prioritize that issue. And I think what so many people fail to recognize when it comes to Donald Trump, they'll say, well, if you supported Trump, then you must be a racist and you don't care about people and da-da-da-da. Sure, there's racists, and at very least they're, like, indifferent to the things that he said that are bigoted.
Right.
But, like, it also can be the case that you actually don't like those things about Donald Trump, but you do like something else about Donald Trump, and that thing is your priority. So when I resist saying that Donald Trump is manifestly worse than Joe Biden, it's for two reasons. One is that reason, that, like, I do think that it helps to elide important ways in which some voters would still choose Donald Trump because their number one issue is foreign interventionism or something like that. Now, I also think that the right is giving Trump way too much credit on being, like, a dove. And I think that's a perfectly fair criticism. But I'm trying to speak to where people are coming from in public. Like, that's the perception. And the other reason I bristle at it is because I think it is the kind of question that has the potential, and I was workshopping this on Rising this morning, that has the potential to, when you ask a question that's asking people to ignore their personal priorities, pretending that there's only the matter of politics and not their priorities, you end up asking questions that fracture a potential coalition. And we just saw this with Jimmy Dore in Cornel West. Jimmy Dore was frustrated that Cornel West did not agree with him that COVID mandates were the most important issue. Cornel West agreed that mandates were an important issue. Just personally for him, they're one of many important issues. And Jimmy Dore said, well, you are prioritizing racism and white supremacy over mandates. And Cornel West says, well, I think that both of those things are important issues.
Exactly. What was the level of corruption that took place during these years? Be able to see not just the text, we know the books are out there, but to have a truth commission so that we can see what voices were marginalized, what voices were pushed aside, and make sure it never happens again. I resonate with the spirit of what my brain, and as important as the issue of vaccines and the COVID situation was, when you say that's probably the most important issue in your lifetime or in the last 25 or 30 years, in light of all the wars, in light of what Palestinians are going through, in light of what workers are going through. 63% of them living paycheck to paycheck in terms of all the vicious attacks of the police and the murders and so forth. And yet this vaccine issue is the most important thing. I say, okay, that's my dear brother Jimmy. He's got a right to raise his voice. I'm not going to in any way push it away, but I just live in a different world. As important as vaccines have been, if I had another chance, I'd be leaning much more with the Black caucus. But when I think of the weightiest issues, vaccines does not come immediately to mind. It just doesn't. That's the kind of world we live in, brother.
Okay.
Maybe I'll spend Yeah.
Well, here it is. Black business owners collapsed by 41%. Black business because of lockdowns. Do you care yet?
Well, no,
70,000 workers in one state were fired because of vaccine mandates. When are you going to care? Do they all have to be trans? When are you going to care about these workers? When are you going to care about? When are you going to care about this?
They have to be trans for me to care.
You don't care. You don't care. Why don't you care about this?
Why would you accuse me? Of course I care about it.
You're saying it's not important.
I didn't say it wasn't important. I said it was not the most fundamental issue in my lifetime the last 30 years.
Forced medical experiments? Forced medical experiments? The scheme?
Where's the nuance?
Oh, my God.
Where's the complexity?
So you missed this story and you're not interested in getting it right.
Agree with Jimmy Dore,
so you missed this story and you're not interested. Well, Dr. West, I wish you the best. You know I love you. You know I support
you and your precious wife. And you stay strong about it.
Okay, I wish you all the best. I love you. Thanks for coming on. I really do wish you all the best. And I just wish you had a clearer message to reach people, but you don't. It's muddled and it's a loser. So good luck, though.
We shall see. But if it does win, we're going to incorporate your best and show how wrong and how off you were too, brother.
And rightly or wrong, intentionally or not, I think that what Jimmy ends up doing in a way that is destructive to a movement is to say, well, if you don't rank priorities exactly like mine, if my number 2 is your number 1 and my number 1 is your number 2, then we can't be we can't play ball together. Mm-hmm. You are betraying my interests simply because your priority is not mine. And that seems to me to be obviously ridiculous. If you're about to be evicted, Rania, and I'm about to have my student loan started, and I say, well, my student loans are my number 1 issue and eviction is and housing costs are your number 1 issue, that's not a problem. Because you know what? I support building more housing and having an eviction moratorium. You can also support student debt cancellation, and we can work together to advance both of our goals.
Yeah.
But there's this way that when you ask Biden, who's better, Biden or Trump, you're forcing people to devalue the things that people critique of the other person. And when my goal is to get rid of the corporate duopoly in both candidates. Right. Why are you making me choose between, as Anita Turner so eloquently put it at one time, a half bowl of shit and a whole bowl of shit?
I love that. And it's true. That's actually a great way to describe them. And, when it comes to the whole Biden or Trump being worse, my personal opinion on that is obviously I think Republicans have worse policies. I mean, they have the same goal, right? One is obviously built around a lot more things that I disagree with than the other. And especially with Republicans, I'll give it this. I think Biden is horrendous on foreign policy, dragging us into World War III, amping up this war with China. Do I think Republicans would be different? No, I don't. Furthermore, I mean, under Trump, you had Trump won another term. I really do believe there would have been a war with Iran. That doesn't mean there's not going to be a war with Iran just because Biden's president. That could still happen. Mm-hmm. It just means that there's a certain belligerence that Republicans have. And you could also make the arguments that Democrats are almost more effective in the way that they run empire around the world because, less belligerence makes a lot of countries get along to get, I don't know. However, I will say this.
I feel like it diminishes us even to have to make these comparisons.
It does. It really does. And I also didn't look, this is not to make anything personal about Jimmy. I did find but there's another element of, I agree with everything you said, but there's another element to it that I actually found quite offensive. Because yes, you can make the argument that you and I, if you're the eviction argument that you just made versus student loan argument, but those things do have a lot in common. I really cannot find any commonality with being upset that somebody is prioritizing the issue of racism, especially in the way that Cornel West does. Because look, we're not talking about identity politics liberalism here.
Right.
Cornel West has a history. He's written books. He had he's marched for a very long portion of his life on this issue, as well as other issues. He's an ardent anti-imperialist. He's an ardent anti-racist. And he's a supporter of the working class. He has that history to him. He's not making it up. He didn't come out of nowhere. It's incredibly offensive for somebody to sit there and argue that white supremacy. I was really stunned by that. Yeah. I really was blown away to see someone sit there and say that, first of all, to detach white supremacy from class when this country, the US, was founded on white supremacy for the purposes of using slave labor. That's so basic. Come on, dude. And that still exists now. In fact, if you want to argue about who's fascist, the US has historically been a fascist country. it also speaks to the narrow way in which we look at fascism, because we really haven't integrated the idea of like America's founding, the first 500 years of like slavery, then talking about Jim Crow. This was like a fascist dictatorship that Nazis took inspiration from.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a conversation for something else, but it's just to say that if you want to have some conversation, some narrow conversation about if Trump or Biden is more fascist or whatever, without even understanding the history of the US and the importance of racism to that continues today, it's incredibly offensive. And then to say that, of all people, to say it to Cornel West really bothered me. And then to juxtapose that with the treatment I saw, and maybe this speaks to the issue of really prioritizing the COVID mandates, but I didn't see that sort of hostility towards RFK, let's say, who maybe he has your mandate politics, but I think it's 2023. I personally don't find the issue of mandates to be relevant or important. I don't see anybody pushing them anymore. I forgot COVID existed at this point, right? Like we live in a different world now. So it's just to be harping on that and then to use that to attack someone for prioritizing such an important issue to the fabric of America and coming at it from a very good faith perspective, to me is just, what's more, honestly, this is going to sound mean, but what's more Democrat than attacking Cornel West? Like,
well, and I thought you were going to bring up, and you alluded to this, the kind of level of energy that he brought to pushing back against Cornel West versus RFK Jr., who said some very craven things about Palestinians that I think would have justified. And to Jimmy's defense, he did push back against him, and then he did try to set up the chat with Max Blumenthal, which then RFK Jr. reneged on. But it was curious, I would say. It was odd and startling, the level of energy that Jimmy Dore pushed back at Cornel West with, especially given that Cornel West substantially agreed with him. There was just this weird bickering over what the ranking was, which is, again, back to this point. Like, are we as leftists offering up our opinions and our strategy and our goals and opening up conversation with an aim toward finding a place of agreement? Oh, great. You also care about mandates. I also care about white supremacy. Let's work together. Or is it about proving that the thing that we care about and the thing that we have decided is our hobby horse is the most important thing? And I really am not trying to be Pollyanna about it, but I see the way these things go. And it's like, if you think that union labor, if you think that the NLRB rules are very, very significant, I would much rather be having a conversation about how we maintain the gains that have happened for labor under Biden, under the next Republican candidate. Because it's not, are we really just saying that there's never going to be another Republican president who's immediately going to wipe out all of that progress? No. So then let's have a more constructive conversation about how to maintain that, and also in the alternative, how we can be working to build third parties. Why is this even a divisive conversation? I'm glad that there are people to the left of Biden in the Democratic primary. I look forward to voting for Marianne Williamson in the Democratic primary because it takes nothing away from my vote for Cornel West later on, and that's a vote against Biden. Like I wasn't in love. I do personally like Marianne Williamson, but I wasn't in love with Howie Hawkins, sorry. It doesn't even need to be about that. It's like a strategic vote. Like, why are these things being framed as in conflict with each other or mutually exclusive?
Yeah. And also, I really don't understand why the onus is on everybody else to just automate. And we've had this conversation so many times, like on the left, but why is it every 4 years the Mehdi Hassans have to put the onus on you or me or a number of other people Susan. to just give their vote to Joe Biden? I'm sorry, you need to earn my vote. What? I don't owe you anything.
There's also, it's just impossible. It's okay, so I don't mean to give the game away here, but even if I were to be planning to vote for Joe Biden, say I'm in the, for lack of a better word, kind of Krystal Kyle camp. And I believe in my heart, in my soul, that it's a priority to stop Donald Trump from being in office. Don't say that you're going to vote for him no matter what. Just don't say it. Just say hey, my vote can be earned, but here's the conditions of my vote. I agree with you that stopping Donald Trump is an important goal. And so to do that, you need to earn my vote by not just saying you're going to stop Donald Trump, but also following through on your promise to cancel student debt or get a $15 minimum wage or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Like, that's how leverage comes. Cornel West is a boon to anybody who wants to push Biden left, including someone like Mehdi Hasan. You should be yelling at Joe Biden to do what he has to do to neutralize the threat of Cornel West by making Cornel West look not that appealing, because Biden has the ability to both provide what Cornel West is offering and is more likely to stop Trump. That should be the argument.
Right. And the other thing, too, about what you just said is we know Cornel West isn't going to win the presidency.
Right.
Like, I know that the PSL candidates are not going to win the presidency. Like, if you want to talk about political strategy, again, let's go back to why are you discouraging people in California from voting for a third party when it does not matter? The people in California voting third party, a certain segment of them, doesn't matter. It's going to be a Democrat state. It's not going to go to Trump. And if I'm wrong, you can play this clip 1,000 times and blame me. But I'm saying that because I know I'm not wrong, right?
Look, so like, if there are enough Green Party voters in California to swing California for Republicans, frankly, I'm sorry, this is another one of those things I'm getting in trouble for saying. What an incredible endorsement of the power of independent voters. Holy smokes. We've got something on our hands, people. We're cooking with fire. Let's keep pushing. Because that means maybe we can win. Exactly. And, I'll say this, like, I'll admit during the last election, I voted for Biden. And one of the reasons I did is because, and I didn't tell, but the other thing is I didn't wag my finger at anybody else and say, you have to do it. Like, vote for who you're going to vote for. I voted for Biden because I really thought, like, if there was another Trump presidency, 100%, there was going to be a war on Iran, and that would affect a region I care deeply about. When I live in it, my family's from here. And again, that didn't mean I thought that Biden wasn't going to do war on Iran. I just have an understanding that, like, it would be less likely. So that was my strategic voting for that time period. I don't think it really affected or changed anything. I'm not delusional about my vote, which is another thing too. It's like, come on, you guys. Do you really think that, like, your one vote in this presidential election that's state by state, it's just a complete collapsing of the actual system of voting in America? And I do want to go back to another thing, by the way, because I was mentioning the way people abroad feel about this stuff too. The American exceptionalism at play with the way people think about the election is so interesting to watch from abroad, because it's like all these people around the world recognize that I went to the dermatologist last week, right? I had a dermatology appointment and the guy was like, oh, like, talk to me about what I do for a living and this kind of stuff. I'm like, I'm a journalist and I cover this. And he was like, oh yeah, it doesn't matter who wins, right? And at first he said that Joe Biden has an oatmeal brain, which I thought was funny. Like, people really watch what's happening in America from abroad. So everybody knows that Joe Biden can't, like, form coherent sentences oftentimes. So that was one. But two, he said to me, oh yeah, like, does it really matter which one wins? Isn't it just going to be the same? And that's a really common understanding. And what people mean when they say that is, as far as, like, police brutality goes, as far as the Cold War on China goes, as far as sanctions on a third of the freaking world is under economic warfare led by the US, as far as that goes, and on and on and on, these things don't change. And in fact, a lot of the world, you could look at the war in Ukraine and the way a lot of the world perceives that. The polling has shown that a lot of the third world especially is quite sympathetic to Russia. Not that they agree with the invasion, but in their minds, it's like, oh, like, obviously NATO provoked this war. A lot of the world understands and recognizes that. And just going back to the election situation, it's like, if only Americans knew this perspective, because perhaps it would make them consider that their political system isn't quite as democratic as they're told it is. Like, you literally, like, this is not democracy. Being yelled at by Mehdi Hasan and others, it's like to force you to vote for this one candidate in this two-party dictatorship is not democracy. And it's very, very sad. And then when you consider the people who don't even vote, like, there's a significant portion of the US population does not even come out to vote. Oftentimes these are poor and working class people. And maybe they're the people who we should be getting to vote for third parties. Well, to that end, I want to play you a clip from the most recent version episode of Pod Save America. In this clip, you'll hear them concerned about this exact question, which is whether or not they're going to be able to get the disaffected voters, the greater percentage of Biden voters from 2020 who no longer want to vote for him as compared to Trump 2020 voters, which are sticking with him. And the fact that those people are younger, browner, and less college educated, what the Democratic Party is going to do about that. Let's take a listen.
I went into the New York Times Siena poll that came out in early August to look at what the crosstabs said and compared it to the Pew validated voter study of 2020, which is probably one of the 2 or 3 best pieces of data we have about who actually voted and who they voted for. And what I found is that the main reason this race is so close is that Joe Biden is underperforming with his 2020 voters right now. So in that New York Times poll, Trump is getting 91% of the people who voted for him in 2020, and Biden's getting 87% of his voters. And 9% of people who voted for Biden in 2020 in this poll are either claim they won't vote if the race is between Biden and Trump, or intend to vote for a candidate other than Biden or Trump. And that's the difference right there. And now that group is disproportionately made up of younger voters, voters under the age of 45. You know, interestingly enough, 16% of voters 30 to 44 are planning to vote for a third-party candidate or not vote at all. Like, that's a huge chunk of Biden's base. And the other group is non-white voters, particularly Black and Latino voters, are supporting Biden at much lower rates than they were in all the polls, not just the New York Times poll, than they did in 2020. And that is the delta between where Biden wants to be and where he is right now.
Yeah, and particularly non-white, non-college educated, younger voters are a tough group for Biden. And Nate Cohn dug into this in a piece this week in the New York Times.
That you should steel yourself before you read, because
steal yourself before you read it. But it's based on the same New York Times Siena poll that you dug through. Mm-hmm. And what's fascinating and sort of terrifying is that Biden, and in not just that poll, but other polls, Biden and Trump are both doing the same as they did in 2020 with white voters. And then for Biden, non-white voters who are college educated, he's still doing really well. And non-white voters who are older, he's still doing the same. But it is younger non-white voters who are either, and look, some of them have said that they'll vote for Trump this time. There's a portion that said that. Some, as you said, will say they're not going to vote, and some will vote third party. And I think that what's extra tough about this, which I know from the last season of The Wilderness that I did, is like these voters, these are not like voters who were super progressive and they're just like waiting for some organizer to knock on their door and tell them like Joe Biden is more progressive than you think and look at all the good things he's done and blah, blah, blah. That's not who these voters are. They actually tend to be more moderate, even though they're young and non-white, and the reason they tend to be more moderate is all the young non-white voters and white voters who are very progressive, they're already voting. They're going to vote for Joe Biden. They're out there. It's whatever. It's these voters who are disaffected from politics. They do not consume politics like we do. They do not consume the news as much as we do, which also makes them harder to reach for a campaign. So throwing up an ad on television is not necessarily like, I think, the best way to reach these voters. They're not going to read a lot of the coverage of the race. And I think the real challenge for the Biden campaign is going to be figuring out how to reach these voters who are disaffected from politics in the first place, but did turn out to vote for Joe Biden.
All right, wow. Rania, react.
I mean, like, I'm waiting for them to just call for deporting these people. Like, that was actually incredibly racist. And anti-poor, because the people they're talking about, they were like non-white, brown, these non-white, what are we going to do with these non-white voters? Geez, you guys. Moreover, I mean, they're basically just talking about poor and working class people who don't have time to engage with their podcast or like to watch MSNBC or CNN or Fox News because they're too busy like working 2 jobs or like just trying to make it in a very difficult country.
Yeah, I mean, you can hear them wrestling with the settled expectations about how certain kind of people vote becoming unraveled. So the expectation for the Democratic Party for years, that was really spoiled by Donald Trump was that the browning of America was good for the Democratic Party, that Latinos in particular, a more faster growing population group than Black Americans, were going to definitely be Democrats, and therefore Republicans are basically going to be yesterday's news. That hasn't been happening. They point specifically to people who did once vote for Biden. This is what's confusing them. You saw the light at one time. You did once vote for Biden.
What happened?
But you have changed your mind. You have not been sold on the job that this guy did. And that of those group, people under 45, which by the way, is not that young. I mean, I would love for it to be the case as someone who is about to age out of that group even. But people under 45, and then 16% of 30 to 44 are going to vote third party or not vote at all. And then you hear at the end of that clip them talking about how to go out and target and get those people back in line. Rania,
I don't know.
Should third-party campaigns, should the left be engaging in a similar conversation about how to target those people to vote green? Or, as many of the left seems to feel following my debate with Krystal and Kyle, should we similarly be worried about the fact that those people aren't going to vote for Joe Biden again and try to knock doors and get them to turn out the vote for Joe Biden?
I mean, I think that's a Joe Biden problem, not a you and I problem. So it's like I'm not going to go knock on people's doors and tell them why they should vote for Biden. And I think this speaks to what you were saying earlier. Is this is the group of people whose lives didn't change, right? Trump was president, then Biden was president, and nothing in their lives changed. Life is still very difficult. They still can't afford a lot of things. And in fact, maybe they can't afford even more things because at least during COVID, there was some level of assistance for people. And that has gone away now. Inflation, has caused the cost of living to go up, whereas salaries these people probably aren't even making salaries. They're probably making hourly wages. Those certainly haven't gone up. I mean, these are the people who probably are making under $30,000 a year. And I mean, I mentioned a significant portion of the US population of the voting population doesn't vote. And a lot of those people are poor and working class people. And maybe the portion of them who does vote, almost across the board, across racial lines, across geography, people who make under $30,000 a year typically do vote Democrat. So it might be people who just do it because Democrats do pretend to be the party of the working class, even if they're obviously not. And at least they're not actively promoting policies against the working class. They're giving some lip service to the idea that they want to raise the minimum wage at least. So when somebody who makes minimum wage hears that, it's compelling. But if you've been voting Democrat before and your wage didn't change, what does that mean, right?
Yeah.
So go ahead.
I mean, not to bring this back, I really didn't mean this episode to be an episode about the debate with Krystal and Kyle, but for me, one of the sticking points was they asked me, I think this was a really good question from Krystal. They asked me what it would take for me to really give Joe Biden credit and even vote for him. What it would take for me. And I wanted to be really clear about this. And I do think it's been lost in some of the weird Twitter version of recounting this. My problem with Biden, given who he is not that he's not Bernie Sanders. I don't have any expectation that he's Bernie Sanders. My problem with Biden is that he is not who Biden said that he was going to be as he ran for office. And what I want to do on this show, the value of this show, and what I think the value of all left reporting should be, is to continue the work of expanding the realm of the possible, the way that Bernie Sanders and once AOC did. And that is to be really honest about what Biden could do with the power at his disposal by executive orders and outside of the limitations of the Senate, and also what Democrats could do with the Senate if they really wanted to. Mm-hmm. And that's why student debt is a big issue for me, not because I have student debt, which I because of Trump's moratorium, I can pay off now. I got the email today about my $2,500 a month that's going to be due in the beginning of October. Ooh. And I'm grateful to be able to, that's my monthly payment amount. I'm glad to be able to pay it all off now because I've been able to save money because I haven't been accruing interest during the moratorium. But millions of Americans, 44 million Americans, in fact, are not in that same position. So yes, student loan debt is an issue because he made a promise that he reneged upon and he could have fulfilled it via executive order. Similarly, the $15 minimum wage. The $15 minimum wage rigmarole. The $15 minimum wage was a part of the must-pass legislation in the first few months of Biden's presidency. And they used this bullshit, I'm sorry, with the parliamentarian, and Chuck Schumer stripped it from the bill, and we never got an up-down vote on that. So to me, my job is not to pat Joe Biden on the head or to tell him he did a good job on other things, even if he did do a good job on other things. My job is to ask the question of why Joe Biden intentionally or ignorantly sabotaged one of the core promises that he made to the American people so that there's an opportunity for accountability going forward. That's my only job.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And, the other thing, too, is that your job also isn't that. There's an entire network devoted to doing that, by the way. There's more than one.
Yes.
You could argue. There's like 2 cable news networks that are basically function as like state TV in the US that function as advertisements for Joe Biden. And they reach a way bigger audience than you do or I do or even Krystal and Kyle do. Like our audiences are like pennies compared to CNN, MSNBC, right? So like why it just to me it's very I hate to call people authoritarian. I'm not calling Krystal and Kyle authoritarian because obviously they had you on their show and I appreciated that you guys had that debate. I just disagree with a lot of what they said, but at least they were willing to have it.
Absolutely.
However, others are not. And to me, like that's a very authoritarian way of looking at this entire issue is like it's either you do PR for the Democratic Party and for Biden or you don't get to speak. That seems to be what a certain subset of people are saying. And this to me is completely unacceptable, especially because these people are claiming, this is what's so offensive, is a lot of these people are claiming to speak on the most marginalized and the most vulnerable people. A lot of these people happen to also be millionaires and multimillionaires. I'm talking about the people on, who have cable news shows, for example, or, the big names who attack on Twitter. Like, are you really telling me that you, the millionaire, or you, the person who's making hundreds of who's making 6 figures times a lot, are really speaking for the little guy? You're forcing me. You're like smearing me into voting for Joe Biden because you're really working on behalf of like these people you claim to speak for, who according to Pod Save America aren't even sure they're going to vote for Biden.
Right. Right. You can hear them kind of struggling with how to talk about these people who are exhibiting a behavior that for the last 5 years or the last however many years since 2016 has been characterized as evil, right?
Yeah.
Like if you aren't actively opposing Donald Trump at the ballot box, you are evil. You don't care about women. You don't care about reproductive rights. You don't care about minorities. You don't care about Black people. You don't care about Muslims. You don't care about anybody. Like that's the narrative, right? So then what do you do when there's a bunch of 30-year-old Blacks and Latinos in working class jobs who are not only not voting for Biden, but once voted for Biden and now are like, I'm good, didn't help, didn't like it, not doing it again. And even some of them, you heard Jon Favreau say, some of them even plan to vote for Trump. What do you do with that? You need a different narrative. So speaking of narrative building, there is some recognition elsewhere in this podcast that Trump is doing a kind of a faux populism. And I want to be very clear. I think it is a faux populism. It is not real populism. And let me just say for the record, I personally, Briahna Joey, I'm not telling you what to do. I won't be voting for Democrats. I 100,000% won't be voting for Republicans, in case there was any doubt about that. But listen to them try to engage with this question of whether Biden can beat Donald Trump's version of populism.
Most Americans, most voters, if you ask them, they will say that like Washington's broken, that politicians are corrupt and stupid and blah, blah, blah. And so like as to be a successful leader, you have to both channel the emotion that's out there in the country, which is very anti-Washington, very anti-establishment, very anti-institution right now. But especially if you're a Democrat, for Republicans, it's almost easier. But if you're a Democrat, you have to be the defender of institutions that aren't working very well for people or that people are pretty upset with. And I think Obama always felt that tension as well. And I don't think it's an accident that by the end of his presidency, when you heard Obama talk about Joe Biden, Harry Reid, or Nancy Pelosi, he talked about the 3 of them with like such reverence. Yes. And he had so much respect for them. And I think that respect was developed over time. And I can remember like edits to speeches where we would say, oh, Washington's doing this and Washington's doing this because we had that muscle from the campaign, from the 08 campaign. And he would say, you know what? I get some shit from this from from people in Congress and the staff by being like, I should point out that it's actually Republicans. It's not people in Washington. And so he even evolved a little bit over time. So I think he learned that from Joe Biden, and then Joe Biden sort of,
that's totally fascinating. It's
Yeah.
really, I think that Biden in some ways needs to unlearn a little bit of that himself, that he's channeled Trump's populism and policy, that he's got this industrial policy that's reviving American manufacturing. He's taking on the problem of monopoly in a way that's very, very robust. We got this Google trial that's just about to begin. He's got his merger guidelines. He's made unionism more acceptable in the country. I think he's lent his prestige to that.
What?
And then he needs to turn that into the rhetoric of populism, which he's loath to do because it requires having an adversarial relationship with certain forces in American life. And he's capable of doing that through policy. But his Labor Day speech last week, I think, did a pretty effective job of foreshadowing what I think would be a good campaign strategy. I'm a terrible political consultant, so
I agree with you, because I think it solves a couple problems for him. Like when he is fighting and energetic, it speaks to the age concerns, and it also sort of speaks to a discontent in the electorate, right? And this economic populist streak, which, like you say, like his policy certainly reflects. And I've heard him do this. To me, the Scranton Joe is like the best kind of Joe, Joe Biden, when he's out there on the stump.
Yeah, totally. And in that speech, he did a great job of connecting it to Donald Trump and describing Donald Trump as this phony Park Avenue guy who only talks about these things. But Joe Biden, the politician, is actually able to deliver for you.
All right. What planet? What planet are these people living on? Did they not watch his speech in Maui where he literally tried to compare, I don't even know, was it even a fire? Like a smoke alarm went off or something in his house, in his kitchen, mansion, in one of his mansions. The smoke alarm went off and nobody was hurt. And he was like, I know how you guys feel. After a horrible, I don't know who they're talking about. Scranton Joe is a figment, is a PR stunt. It does not exist. This man is a multimillionaire who, like you said, took more corporate money than anybody ever. I don't know what populist policies they're talking about. Sure, there are a couple things here and there you could point to that Joe Biden has done that's better than Trump. But there's nothing populist. There's nothing working class about it. It's just a centrist Democrat being a centrist Democrat. This is so absurd that these people are trying to bring before us this man who literally cannot articulate sentences. There's obviously some sort of cognitive decline going on that we're not allowed to talk about, and it's very sad for him. But and you're trying to pretend like there's a way to transform this corporate millionaire who cannot speak into somebody that people want to vote for based on an image problem, when the problem is also the policies. It's also your party. And the fact that they can't see that shows so much because they're millionaires too.
So I keeping, some of Kyle's arguments in mind. Let me say this. I am happy to give Biden all the credit in the world for antitrust legislation, his Department of Justice pursuing more aggressive antitrust law. I'm happy to give support for the union gains that Krystal brought up. I'm happy to happily do all of that. But here's the problem, and I think they unintentionally underscored why none of that policy that is popular and populist translates more broadly. It's because they put it as, well, Joe Biden feels comfortable doing that in policy, but he isn't comfortable doing it out loud because he's unwilling to be adversarial to certain parts of government. Well, it's not that he's not comfortable being adversarial. He is not adversarial. So he is able to, with small incremental policy measures, throw a bone to various groups. Bones that, by the way, are impermanent and completely contingent on the staffing of a given administration. They're already coming after Lena Khan. So at the same time, like they're saying out loud, Obama used to be someone who would call out the swamp and call out Washington. And then he got into office and other senators would say, no, don't blame Washington on X, Y, and Z. Blame the Republicans. You're hurting my feelings. Don't be adversarial to us. The system isn't broken. It's just a few bad apples. And Obama learned that from Biden. And now Biden's wondering why people don't believe him as a genuine populist when he wants to pat his friends like Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell on the back and say, no, actually, he didn't just have an episode and isn't qualified to be in Congress anymore. No, Nancy Pelosi shouldn't have the hammer thrown at her for opposing all of these insider trading bans. No, Dianne Feinstein is the picture of health. It's that's the core issue, is that it's not that he's having trouble expressing populist sentiments out loud. It's that his desire, his actual orientation is to be an insider.
Yes. And he certainly was an insider throughout his time in the Senate and as vice president, but especially throughout his very long time in the Senate, where, I mean, okay, I could be mistaken here, but I'm pretty sure when we talk about antitrust, didn't he play a role working with Republicans to like basically take away the ability to go after like monopolies at one point?
Did he?
It sounds like maybe, I feel like that would be a Biden thing to do. And I'm sorry if I'm spreading something that's not accurate, but also going back to being an insider, if we want to talk about populist stuff now, there's so many examples we can give, like on the student loan issue. Biden was crucial to a lot of the problems we have with student loan stuff now. And by the way, on a personal level, I'm very upset about the fact that like I initially qualified for the student loan relief and then I didn't, like overnight, because Biden refused to stick with it and was making some bizarre legal argument that like, oh no, we have to limit it to just these people or else it will be torn down or whatever. And then it still was, regardless.
Literally tens of millions of people got the email in their inbox. It was a very easy form. It seemed almost too good to be true because the government never does anything that easy. And then almost immediately, because it was a means-tested program, gave the opportunity, this is what I was explaining to Kyle, gave the challengers an opportunity to argue that they had standing to oppose it, and some of them were successful. If he had simply done it, then they would have been in the position of arguing that somehow he had to put the money back into our bank or put the balances back on the balance sheet, which would have been almost impossible to do. But because he chose to means test the program instead of simply canceling all student debt and taxing rich people who got an unearned benefit on the back end, now nobody got it. The student debt is an example of one of his biggest failures. And one of my biggest frustrations, I think, from the debate was the idea of that failure being an unforced error being used as an example of why people should affirmatively vote for Biden. Yeah,
and you also did make a really good point about like the permanence. Because, okay, for example, there was this overtime pay that like Donald Trump undid, that Obama put in place, an overtime pay rule that was put in place by Obama, that then Trump undid, that then Biden just restored, right? And this is like one of the things that I'm sure will be trotted out as like, oh, he's so populist and wonderful, look what he did. And it is true, like say what you want about Obama or Biden, like all the bad things we think about them, it was Democrats who did something about that rule, while Trump did the opposite, which shows that Trump is not the populist he claims to be, right?
Of course.
However, a Republican's just going to come and undo it again. Like it's like this ping pong kind of thing. Like they, it's just going to go back and forth. So like there's those kinds of things, but then there's a lack of permanence to them. So those little wins, then that one actually I think is more useful to use with voters than antitrust. Most voters are like, this doesn't register with people. People aren't going to go around and be like, oh, I didn't know that. I'm going to vote for Biden now that I know that he's doing antitrust stuff. Like most voters don't know what that means.
Yeah.
But they do know that overtime pay is a thing. So that's actually a better argument to make. But the point is there's no permanence to it.
And it's by design.
Yes.
And you don't have to look. It seemed Kyle bristled a little at the idea that I said it was that Biden chose to do the student debt plan in a way that wouldn't work. I obviously can't prove that. I don't know what's in his brain. But either he intentionally wanted it to fail or he's a moron. And I don't think either of those is especially something that I want to endorse. But with the COVID era interventions that were so amazing and that Democrats are continuing to brag about, even though they're all over, you could have made them last longer than a year or 18 months or whatever it was. You could have made them permanent. And you could say, well, Republicans wouldn't have voted for it. Okay, then now we're in the middle of a pandemic with one opportunity for a reconciliation bill that includes the vaccines that were necessary to get businesses going again, which both corporate parties were very much invested in happening, and asking Republicans to vote that down because they want to make the argument that we shouldn't permanently have child poverty. We should only do it for 18 months. That's how you get into a position where you have the broader public thinking, yeah, Republicans are better than or Democrats are better than Republicans because they're having a drag out fight about Republicans saying, absolutely not, I'm going to vote down COVID spending and the end of this pandemic over feeding children. And Democrats are saying, no, we should feed children. But we never have that tee off because we get this Kabuki theater of Manchin and cinema and the thumbs down, and then Bernie votes to get it back in but it's not reconciliation. So we need 60 votes. And oh gosh, we tried. And I gotta say, look, that is the core. That is the core fuel that enables the Democratic Party to perpetuate the fiction that they are really the good guys.
Yeah.
Is that they have to pretend. Republicans can just say, I'm bad. We don't believe in government. We want to strip it. We're going to do it. Democrats have to do a bit more of a delicate dance. And the whole liberal media infrastructure is running cover for their lying about how much they can really do for the American people. The left media should not be a part of that project.
Right. They know they shouldn't. And you know what? You could say that about international issues too. I mean, look, Biden, after one thing he did not undo, right? Obama normalized relations with Cuba, and Americans could actually like go visit as tourists. I think over 1 million Americans went and visited Cuba. It was really good for the Cuban economy. And then Trump comes, undoes that, reapplies sanctions. Biden comes into office. He could have just reverted back to a policy of his predecessor, who he was the vice president for. And instead, what did he do? He added more sanctions to Venezuela. And now, or I'm sorry, to Cuba. God, I'm just like getting sanctioned countries mixed up now. But to Cuba, and then also Syria too. Syria, more sanctions on Syria. You could even make the argument, and this is not me making like a Democrats are worse argument. It's an argument about the fact that they're both so destructive for so much of the world. I mean, it was under Obama that you had the war on Syria that destroyed that country, that tried to put in place, like, give power to a bunch of religious fascist groups, regardless of what you think about the Syrian government. It doesn't matter. We should not be supporting groups that are allied with Al-Qaeda. I mean, we are recording this on 9/11. I feel like this is a day when we should be saying very clearly that Al-Qaeda is a bad group and we shouldn't be giving them weapons and money. And that's essentially what happened under Obama, both in Syria and Libya, and destroyed two, before that, relatively stable countries with decent infrastructure that are now like ruined, and people are constantly trying to leave. And you could make the argument it actually ruined the politics of Europe by making Europe more right-wing because of the influx of immigrants. But that happened under Obama. Like the regime change attempts in Venezuela, the sanctions on Venezuela, that didn't start under Trump. That started under Obama and then continued under Trump. And it's continued under Biden. Like, for so much of the world, we live on a planet with like almost 8 billion people. For so much of the world, the policies of these people don't matter. Like Afghanistan right now, families are selling their organs. People are selling their organs to feed their children because Biden, not Trump, Biden has frozen the central bank assets of Afghanistan because the country went back to the hands of the Taliban after the U.S. couldn't manage to like fight them for 20 years. Which shows you the U.S. is not good at doing more. Regardless, people in Afghanistan are literally selling their children. Like, this is a common thing now, selling organs. This is horrible. They're starving to death. And that's not going to change whether Biden or Trump is in office. Same for Palestinians. Their lives don't change. Israel can continue to commit ethnic cleansing, continue to institute a policy of apartheid, become increasingly fascist, and regularly kill Palestinians who are under occupation. Doesn't matter. Like, it just, I could go on and on and on. And again, I'm not making a false equivalency here. I do recognize there are variations, but to me, it's just so offensive when people, especially at mainstream networks, but people in general sit there and demand that we vote for somebody who is still committing horrendous crimes on behalf of US empire around the world. And you know who I would prefer to vote for, give my time to, and have on my show, you know, or give airtime to, is people who are actually advocating dismantling that system that I just described, right? The same system that is like causing, you know, people in the US to have to work 2 or 3 jobs just to afford to pay back their student loans or put a roof over their head. It's the same capitalist system that's like destroying so many parts of the world right now. And to like pretend that that doesn't exist is, I mean, I think it's like a crime of media in a way, or it's like, it's just pure negligence, or just you don't care, you're getting a big paycheck and you just want to do work on behalf of your billionaire, you know, funders at whatever mainstream network you're working at.
But Rania, isn't the important thing that Democrats are better?
I don't know. I'll go around tomorrow in Beirut and ask around what people think. See if they really care.
I'm glad you brought up this question of like, specifically, again, there are these issues that were a big deal under Trump, and then seemed to trickle away into, we're not talking about it anymore now that Biden is president. And I do think while Trump is worse than Biden, there is this way that in terms of the kind of left pushback against draconian policies, having a Democrat in office is more of a death knell to movement energy to rectify those kinds of crimes and harms than a Republican being in office. So Joe Biden's continuation of Donald Trump's immigration policies is one of the biggest dark marks on Joe Biden's record. And it is one, to just bring it back to what we started with, that AOC was asked about in a surprisingly adversarial way in this New York Times interview. The interviewer asked, speaking of our closest neighbors, I want to talk about immigration. Under Biden, more asylum seekers are being held in private detention centers than under Trump. Families are still being separated. The Biden administration kept Trump-era policies that sped up deportations and made it harder for legitimate claimants to come to the U.S. So what grade do you give the administration on immigration? She does not give a grade. She says immigration is arguably this administration's weakest issue. This is one area where our policy is dictated by politics, arguably more so than almost any other. There are very clear recommendations and suggestions we have made to the administration, to provide relief on this issue. And it is my belief that some of the hesitation around this has to do with fear around just being seen as approving or providing permission structures, or really just the Republican narratives that have surrounded immigration. I would translate that as they think it's bad politics to not be Trump on immigration. It's bad politics for Biden not to double down or at least continue Trump's immigration policies. And then she says we need to look at root causes. But the interviewer doesn't drop it. To their credit, the interviewer follows up saying, I mean, it doesn't start at our border. And I know this has been a right-wing talking point, but I do want to understand your thinking here. Why haven't you used your considerable clout as a Latina leader to visit the border and highlight the ongoing issues there now, like you did during the Trump administration? She says, well, this is something that we're actively planning on. What I have done is tours of our New York area facilities. Right now, this crisis is in our own backyard. We have toured the Roosevelt Hotel. And I think it's been very important for us to, especially to my constituents who are demanding accountability on this, to look at that front line that's right here in New York City. The interviewer still doesn't let it go, says, well, I want to get to New York, but we're 2.5 years into this administration. The crisis has been burgeoning, and you have been a self-declared and widely viewed leader on this issue. AOC. Yes. Well, I mean, again, I think this is something that we have been working on, but when the crisis is right here in our own backyard, I have absolutely prioritized having that visitation presence. And I think there's a very, very dangerous understanding of the front line of our immigration crisis just being at the border, yada, yada, yada. The interviewer, but under the Trump administration, you did make the southern border an issue. She says, yes. And again, I will be visiting the border.
I don't know. I haven't seen any photos of her crying at the border under Biden. And that's a really good point, by the way, is the issue of deportations, the issue of like babies in cages. I mean, that hasn't really stopped. I mean, it's not the same policies as under Trump. However, all the same horrendous stuff is going on because this is a systemic problem that exists under any administration. And it is a bipartisan, like approved way of dealing with the immigration crisis that you could actually make the argument began under Bill Clinton. Like a lot of these policies, the foundation of them is under Bill Clinton in the 90s, specifically 1996, for many things he instituted under Customs and Border Enforcement and the way that they deal with capturing people and imprisoning them and then deporting them. And it just got worse and worse and worse under both Republicans and Democrats. And we know Obama was the deporter in chief. But again, this goes back to politics. And essentially what AOC is saying there is that we can sacrifice. It's okay that Biden, it's not the biggest deal in the world for now that Biden is sacrificing immigrants for political purposes. I don't know why that's acceptable suddenly. But I think the point, to go back to the point you started with there, is you were asking if the Democrats tend to be more like them being in power suppresses left movements, maybe, or left pushback. That is an argument that certainly could be made. I think Obama for sure played that role. Mm-hmm. But I think that wasn't necessarily because Obama was a Democrat. I think it was more because he wasn't Bush. And Bush was so despised by the end of his second term, as well as the fact that Obama was so new and shiny. Like, you know, and he was different. Like his name was Barack Hussein Obama. Like,
yeah, I think that's what they're getting to a little bit in that pod save clip. It's weird. The second gentleman in that last clip was not one of the pod save hosts. It was a guy who's written a book about Biden's first 2 years of office. You should listen to the whole episode because kind of hilariously he says at the beginning of the interview, yeah, it was supposed to be about his first 100 days, but he didn't do enough, so we had to extend it. And he says this as he's like trying to be complimentary toward Biden. But like there's this weird kind of tell where there's this acknowledgement that what made Obama so popular was his willingness to be anti-establishment, to be adversarial to all of these people that came before him. But also saying like, but it's a good thing that you learn to play the game. So it's almost like they're admitting like you have to seem adversarial without being adversarial. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the bait and switch that so many of us are sensitive to, so many people on the left are sensitive to as they specifically look at AOC and as they specifically look at her answering these questions, given that before she was in office and in the early days, she was going down to the border and crying. She was going to Nancy Pelosi's office and sitting in with climate demonstrators. And now she's being asked, this is the last thing I'll bring up from the interview. She was asked, do you feel more comfortable in the Democratic Party now? The way you described it initially was fraught. They rejected you, and you were definitely trying to change the party. You have said you've pushed the party leftward. Many would agree. So is it okay to be a regular Democrat now? She says, the activist in me always seeks to agitate for more. I think despite there being progress, many people are still woefully underserved in this country. But the Democratic Party has changed dramatically in the last 5 years. Even if you just look at the numbers, I believe it's something around 50% of House Democrats have been elected since 2018. And so what is considered center and moderate now is dramatically different than what it was 5 years ago.
She's really good at like distracting from the initial question because you're just kind of like, oh, she just like is really good at making pretty sentences. She's a good speaker. I don't think. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, well, let me ask you this. Do you think that the Democratic Party has changed dramatically in the last 5 years?
No, I don't. And I think this speaks to the fact that the Democratic Party is not something you can change from the inside. It's something that changes you. That doesn't mean, I mean, look, I know a lot of people who work inside Democratic politics. I'm sure you do as well, who have really good intentions, who have really great politics, and who are doing what they can in their spaces to push this way, right? And great for them. Bless their hearts. So, you know, I think it's important to have those people doing that sort of work. However, do I think that's where the change is really going to come from? I mean, it hasn't worked for 40 years. It's not going to work now. So I think this goes back to the fact that we need to be building institutions outside of it, doing the organizing outside of it. And this is where third parties can be quite useful. And this goes back to the whole issue of why third parties are important. Like, we know Cornel West is not going to be the president. We know that, you know, I would love for that to be the case. It'd be fantastic. A lot of people around the world would love for that to be the case, but it's not going to happen. But it's about the political strategy of how you use it. I would love for Claudia de la Cruz to be president. That would be like a fantasy world because she wants to end capitalism before it ends us. That's their tagline, right? It sounds wonderful. I know it's not going to happen. However, I think that it's very useful to have these candidates running as third parties and to be giving them airtime because they're talking about the actual problems in this country and not doing PR for like a billionaire class, which is what Biden and Trump and whoever else is running for those, or who's going to be the candidate on the Republican side, is working towards, is just maintaining a system that's literally managed by billionaires and big business. Well said. And that's where, that's the reality of the day. And honestly, like, AOC, she can do little things here and there, but we know which side she isn't on. She's certainly not on the side of revolutionary change. That much is for sure.
And maybe in retrospect, she wishes she had never cast her lot in with us because now she's getting flack. And I do think that we're probably about to witness a clearer pivot, which, I'm not saying this in a snarky way. I think that she has a lot of support outside of the left that initially buoyed her to the place that she is now. I think that she has been very openly contemplating a Senate run. I think that she has a belief in the power to make change from the inside, and that's what her priority is going to be. And I sincerely hope that she's able to accomplish as much as what she believes in as she can, because she is to the left of most people in Congress.
Sure.
But I do think it's a warning to the rest of the left who has different priorities than AOC or Joe Biden or perhaps even a Bernie Sanders, that there's going to have to be a different kind of fight that takes place. And I think that it's part of the reason why we should be working very hard to empower people outside of the Democratic Party to provide real leverage and real pressure. And that requires, as Chris Hedges always says, a politics of fear and a real willingness to not be more afraid of a potential bad outcome than the Democratic Party is afraid of losing.
Yeah. And I also think it means recognizing the moment too, because people are making this argument that it's either Democrats or fascists. And that also goes back to we're not going to sit here and define necessarily fascism right now, but you have to have a clear definition.
I fought with Colonel West on this show about whether Joe Biden was a fascist, because I'm like, well, let's make the argument. If we're going to be calling Trump a fascist, let's pull out a dictionary and go through the record.
Well, look, I mean, I don't think either are actual. I think it's this is obviously, I would assume Cornel West understands fascism probably better than I do as the academic he is. But fascism does have a definition. And I don't think either Biden or Trump, while there might be fascist elements to some of what they do, fall under that definition. They just don't. If we had it, if either of them were actual fascists, you would have no press freedom whatsoever. You'd have no trade unions. You'd have no political parties. I mean, fascism is this sort of openly terroristic type dictatorship of the most reactionary elements of monopoly capital. That is the definition of or finance capital. That is the definition of fascism. And so I think if we're going to be making this argument, if people are going to make this argument, I think it's very flippant to just be it's either Biden or a fascist. Because I think
that's fair. My only quibble with him was if we're calling Trump fascist, let's just call Biden fascist too.
Well, they're so similar. They're so similar. I mean, they're both working for the same people, just to different ends. And I guess you could make the argument Trump is closer to fascism if we're looking at a spectrum because he's more right wing. Just by that nature, by being more right wing, You're closer to fascism, right? But at the end of the day, I'll tell you this: my electricity is going to go out in 4 minutes because of America. So that to me, there is a way you could define both of them as fascists in the way that they deal with the rest of the world. I'll put it
on
that
way. Note. Rania, let me give you the opportunity you have while you can still log on to let the people know where they can find more of you. This has been an amazing conversation. More of you on the internet at Breakthrough News and beyond.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. And I'm such a big fan of Bad Faith, and it's an honor to be on your program and all the work that you've done. And to also watch your political evolution has been fun. And I learned so much from you. But anyways, now that we're done praising each other, thank you. The people can follow me I have a show on Breakthrough News called Dispatches on YouTube. Follow Breakthrough News on YouTube. Follow Breakthrough News on Instagram, on Twitter. I'm also on Twitter at Rania Khalek. And we have to have you on at some point. I think that you have been on in the past, but maybe not since I've been there. So we'll have to talk about that.
All right. I'm looking forward to it. Take care of yourself, Rania. This has been such a pleasure. Thank you to all the listeners for tuning in. You know, you can get an additional episode of Bad Faith Podcast every Monday at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. Take care of yourselves and keep the faith. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.